Welcome to the Mason Guard Show. Unscripted, uncensored, unapologetic. Hello and welcome once more to the Mason Guard Show and another episode of Does It Hold Up? I am your host, Scott Mason. Along with me is my co-host, Edward Guard.
Hello.
Hey, and today we are going to be talking about 1994's The Crow. Now, The Crow, for me, was actually a much beloved movie in my teenage years. Probably about 97, 98 is probably when I started watching it. Girlfriend at the time absolutely loved it and quickly got me into it, and so I was right along for the ride. And I absolutely loved this movie way back when. It's probably been 5-6 years since I saw it last, but like even then that kind of tells you how much I've still enjoyed this movie. So I kind of maybe know a little bit what I'm expecting out of this movie. But what about you, Ed? What's your history with the Crow?
So at one point we touched on Goth Scott previously, and I feel like most of my follow-up questions are based on that. I feel like I loved this movie the first time I saw it. I probably didn't see it till many years later, like probably somewhere in the early 2000s when it was the first time that I came across it. It was very dark. At the time, it was probably the darkest movie I'd seen. It touches on topics that I hadn't seen in other films, being 12 or 13 the first time I saw it. But, it was a intense movie then, but you also got sort of a very, very dark lead character who's set on vengeance and murder, and yet you're still behind him, right?
Yeah,
he's still the protagonist of the story, and you're okay with the fact that he was just set on vengeance
and committing violent crimes. Certainly, absolutely. So, okay, so that's kind of your history in there. For those who don't know, The Crow is directed by Alex Proyas, who's a director who hasn't done a lot of stuff, and his work is kind of a mixed bag, if you will. This was his first feature film, was The Crow. He followed it up with what I think is an absolutely amazing movie called Dark City. Again, very dark, visionary kind of film, very odd and different. And then after that, you had I, Robot. And then he followed that up with a film that you and I have discussed in private briefly. And I know one day we are going to have to visit this movie, which is Nicolas Cage's Knowing.
So I'm willing to go out on a limb right now and say that Knowing is an underrated film. Like, I know people have a hard time with Nick Cage, but that movie was creative. I stand by that.
All right, we'll certainly get into that another day, because I think that is a conversation worth having. And his last film was probably one of the more controversial ones in recent memory, Gods of Egypt, which I don't know how much you remember the casting controversy over, just a bunch of white people playing Egyptians.
Yeah.
That certainly didn't fly. So, again, a bit of a mixed bag of a career with Alex Proyas, but again, in each case, a movie that both Ed and I absolutely admire. So, again, I think when you look at this film as kind of the stepping stone for this director, it makes a lot of sense when you see the other films in his filmography. So, this was made on a fairly low budget of $15 million. Made $50 million back in the box office, so actually did really well. And I think we'd be remiss, though, if we went into this without, of course, touching on, the elephant in the room, which is, of course, this is the film that took the life of Brandon Lee, the son of, famed martial artist Bruce Lee.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why people know this movie. This is an interesting thing is the studio really didn't use this to their advantage. They didn't take advantage of the fact that this happened to market the movie.
No, the studio actually dropped the film after the death of Brandon Lee when they thought they couldn't bring it back. They didn't think it was possible, and they had to get bailed out.
Yeah. And another interesting thing I found about it was that when I first watched this movie, I was told that Brandon Lee died in the scene where he's standing on the table in the shootout.
That's what I always assumed as well, right?
And there was even rumors that you can actually see the scene that he died in. And I think that was kind of a later ploy to push the movie out, and amongst young people, they kind of shared that, that piece of information. But
I think it might have just been one of those, kind of pre-internet rumors where you don't really have the ability to confirm everything like you do now with an IMDb or whatever it is. But like back then, you could just tell stories, and no one could really confirm them as easily.
Yeah, I think it's important to say, like, where he actually gets shot is like the first opening scene to the movie. The scene where he gets murdered, essentially, is where he gets murdered, and then after the fact, they had to reshoot a whole bunch of scenes, and they had to be creative on how they're going to finish the scenes, and that actually cost a fortune. And an extra $8 million went into this movie to try and CGI his face onto different scenes and to shoot scenes without him and with doubles, and it cost a fortune to finish this movie because of what happened there.
Yeah, I don't have a complete list of the changes. I did read it earlier, and it's actually probably about like only 7 or 8 things that they really had to do. Most of the movie had been shot when it happened, but there are some obvious parts where they've had to like CG literally his face onto a stunt double, or use other actors obviously standing in for him. The whole thing, of course, was just a misunderstanding with a prop where a piece got lodged in a barrel, and then when they switched to kind of do the blank scene, they load with more gunpowder so that the noise is there. That unfortunately launched the projectile. The actor who was holding the gun at the time is the one who fired it. Has been really struck by this. Couldn't act for a whole year. Has still not watched the movie. I think actually at this point he has passed. I was reading that, but to that day had never watched this movie because he just couldn't, knowing what had happened.
How can you, like, something so tragic like that happening in your career and being responsible for it, but not responsible?
Right.
Like, imagine shooting someone just unintentionally, like,
that's
but
what the script said to do.
You technically aimed a gun and shot him and killed him. You know, like, it's crazy.
It actually led to a lot of increase of safety rules on films. In fact, you can't, when you're shooting a film, point a gun at someone. If it is in any way loaded, then you're going to pull the trigger. They have to make sure that gun is pointed to the side of anyone, and you have to use camera tricks to make it look like that's what it's doing, which I think that's a fascinating thing, and I want to look for that now in every single movie to see how they've done these fascinating shots. So
yeah, I mean, how they don't have safety precautions. They didn't have those safety precautions is crazy. You're still firing a weapon at somebody that is loaded with something, right? So, absolute tragedy, huge loss, and it's crazy this movie even came out after.
All right, well, with that, then let's go into it a little bit about some of the different categories that we talk about here. So right off the bat, the story of The Crow is the story of Eric Draven. He is a musician, and him and his wife have their apartment broken into on All Hallows Eve, or Devil's Night, I guess, as they call it in the film, set in Detroit. And in that break-in, both Eric and his wife are killed. And a year passes, and through the power of magic birds, Eric is brought back to life by the Crow, if you will, to go on a path of absolute just revenge, against those who have wronged him and his girlfriend Shelley.
Yeah, I think it's so not his wife, his fiance. They're actually getting married the next day on Halloween, which is weird. But what can you do?
But it's The Crow.
I think that's what makes the this tragedy so horrible, that he's able to come back from the grave. I think that one thing I did like about this story is they didn't try to over-explain it. They just used that young girl's narration to give you a quick, like, this is terrible, and as a result, his spirit came back, and you just have to accept that, and if you're not comfortable with that being enough story, too bad, we're moving on. He's coming back. Is this a good time to talk about how they cut out that?
Well, that's I was going to say that actually leads really well into, of course, the deleted character of the Skull Cowboy, who was originally intended to be the one to explain the powers to him and be, the mystic guide and everything along the way. And I think he was someone who had the powers of the Crow in the past, but blew it and is forever trapped in purgatory or whatever. And oh my goodness, as I read about the Skull Cowboy, am I so glad they decided to cut the Skull Cowboy.
Yeah, like it probably would have ruined the movie completely. It was a great director's cut decision to get rid of the whole that whole piece. When you're watching this movie, you don't even really care about what they explain. Like the fact that he becomes mortal again because he spends time trying to help other mortals rather than just seek revenge.
His path of vengeance.
Right? Yeah. So he's just there to get revenge, and the fact that he tries to help other people is what makes him vulnerable again. I don't think in the movie needed it. I think that you don't even really care why he's vulnerable at the end of the movie.
They throw in the bit where she shoots the crow, or the other guy shoots the crow, and that weakens his powers. But again, even still, okay, I'm good with that explanation.
Yeah,
moving on.
That's enough.
That's good.
I mean,
right?
if you really...
I didn't need more scenes with another character completely.
Yeah, to explain why. I mean, if you're going to get really hung up on, like, how is that possible? I mean, this really isn't going to make sense to you at all. I mean, he's come back from the dead, he crawls out of a grave, like, all of a sudden, he's here for revenge, and sometimes can see through the crow's eyes, I guess. I guess that's how that works.
Yeah, from time to time, he can sort of see when he needs to. I really like how they use that at the very beginning when he is coming out and the crow guides him to the boots and, the jacket in his apartment, right? Like, there is something kind of fun about that little sequence of events where he's just sitting and pecking and you see Eric just stumbling along.
So I think that's actually one of the scenes that Brandon Lee wasn't even Brandon Lee. That was someone else altogether, which is interesting as well. Like, they're just like, how are we going to do this now? So that's the way they went. Yeah. Definitely a dark story. If you're around my age, this was probably the darkest thing you'd seen yet. If you're like me and not a fan of sort of the horror genre, this kind of bridged that gap to like real sort of
the action horror where again a lot of the violence you see. Maybe not directly, but I mean he shoots Fun Boy.
Stabs
a few
Tintin.
times. The Tintin knives.
What a bunch of terrible names for these bad guys. Tintin, Fun Boy.
Who else did you have in there? Skag?
Yeah.
Skag.
Just
T-Bird.
Just terrible. Like, someone just wrote a list of, like, names. Like, what can we just call some generic bad guys?
And the head guy, his name is Top Dollar. It's actually never mentioned in the film. Played incredibly by Michael Wincott in this movie. But every time I watch it, I cannot help but think of the Crash Test Dummies. I think with the long hair and the way he talks is just very much, I could just see him all of a sudden going, right?
Michael Wincott's kind of like a saving grace of this whole movie. He really got into this weird character. I'm not sure, actually. I'd like to know, but I don't know if this movie came before his role in Robin Hood. Probably. But then he got that super dark role in Robin Hood soon thereafter. I think it was around the same time. But he was a great character in that movie. Plays a great bad guy. Just really dark and twisted. And, weird scenes with his, I guess, his sister. And they kill a hooker right at the start, I think. It's just weird stuff's happening. You just know he's a real bad guy. Likes eccentric weapons. I think he stabbed someone with a sword, and then he is dressed like a swashbuckler later and wants to have a sword fight with the Crow, which was weird.
See, I was so disappointed. I love that the visual that they set up with his display of swords and knives and stuff like that. two things come out of that whole display, man. That's one where I wanted to see that fight at the end where they're both just grabbing weapons from it and disarming each other and grabbing a new one.
I think that's actually
such a great
I think that's a great
opportunity
segue for us to move into the aesthetic of this movie. But let's talk about this story. What did you score this story?
I give it a 3, and it's because there is one thing. I know you call Michael Wincott the saving grace, but to me, the true saving grace really comes in the scenes between Brandon Lee and Ernie Hudson. Anytime those two are just having a real talk, whether it's the first time they meet on the street, don't move. I thought cop said freeze. Yeah, well, I'm a cop and I say don't move, right? And then the whole conversation that comes from there, and then you transpose that into the scene in the apartment, in Albright's apartment, or Ernie Hudson's apartment, and it's so heartfelt and emotional in there. Those scenes to me really do elevate this, and that's why I land on a 3 with this, because I think those moments really do elevate it above kind of cheap action movie cliches and actually bring in some heartfelt moments for me.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you. I did score a little bit lower. I went with a 2 because it was just so basic. Like, it was such a basic
revenge story.
Revenge story. There was no, like, I wasn't really surprised ever throughout it. I do agree, and I did give some weight into the script of this movie because there are some moments that are really are memorable for me. But I did give this story overall a 2. I think that if they had to put the Skull Cowboy in there, I probably would have scored it a 1.
Negative.
But yeah, it's not a bad story. It's just not a good story.
Fair. I can see where you're coming from with that. There are certain parts that just stick in my head, even again years later, that I knew were coming up, so I think I've got to give it, again, maybe it's a nostalgia point that it's getting from me, but it gives me the 3. So moving on to aesthetic here. Now, as you said, this is a dark movie, not just in content, but in visual style. Man, there are some things that are just almost hard to see throughout this.
Absolutely. One thing, I don't know, maybe every except maybe one scene is a night scene, and like 80% are raining.
I think the only moment of sun is actually a great aesthetic moment. Is when Sarah's in the apartment looking for him.
Right, yeah. I think that might be the only daytime shot, if not one more.
Movie.
Yeah. So this story came from a comic book, and a writer who did lose his fiance. So seeing this transition to sort of a film that was in that comic book style, a really dark, gritty movie that came of that made sense.
Originally, they actually wanted it to be in black and white, with the exception of the flashbacks. Like the entirety of the movie, and the studio just wasn't ready to roll the dice on that. And I think about that and I go, yeah, probably not.
Yeah, right? I'm glad they didn't go that way.
The world wasn't even quite ready for Sin City when it came out, and I think that's kind of where this would have ended up, very similar to something like that. So I think that's kind of good with that they didn't go that route. Special effects wise, this does not age well, this movie. No. There's some movies where you can kind of see, like, I love that they used the miniatures for the city scenes and the way they fly over those. Like, it's really great, but anytime the sky is visible and you just have a 3-inch black line around every single character that just is so obvious that it really does kind of take you out of the movie in moments.
Yeah, the visual effects in this movie aren't great. I did enjoy the miniature shots. I did like the gothic feel of the city, the way they made it feel very dark, very comic book, and I can see why that whoever created the vision for Sin City, I think, did take some of this. Yeah, I think that they saw something in this that they probably inspired some of that. But the visual effects when he gets shot in the hand and it comes like his hand grows like it's awful.
That one may be the worst.
Really uncomfortable. But another part of this that I want to talk about is I'm surprised this wasn't a martial arts movie. you've got Brandon Lee, who basically everything he did up to this was a martial arts movie.
Yeah.
And then this movie, he doesn't even have any balance. Like he falls off of stuff. There was no, for someone who's immortal, he doesn't, I guess it's because he just became immortal in his life for 2 days.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's a musician. I don't know if The Crow gives you kung fu grip,
I mean, I wish it did, some of the fight scenes are poor. I do like that he gets his, it's not like he's just, again, crushing people when he goes to encounter them. It's just the fact that he's immortal is the reason he's...
And that's actually what I really like, is the Tintin fight is the perfect kind of example of that. It's not a choreographed, crazy fight where there's, 30 moves and punches and blocks and ducks and this. It's... he throws them into a wall and they argue for a little bit, and then he throws them into another wall and they argue for a little bit, and but then you have the moment where Tintin backs up to throw the knives, and again, just aesthetically, they do that so well.
So apparently,
he's menacing.
The actor who played Tintin took this movie very seriously and went and trained in knife fighting to be prepared for that scene, and I respect it, because he actually did portray someone who was effective with knife fighting.
Yeah.
But awful special effects, nothing that blows you away, and you can tell everything is just...
Yeah. And again, it goes for the film noir, and I think, again, in some places it hits it, in some places it is just too dark. For me, there are some fantastic scenes. I think it relies a little bit too much on Crow flying shots. I could have used maybe a few less of those. Which, again, with the special effects, do really look dated, so maybe that was part of it for me. So,
I mean, with that said, there were a couple of good scenes that I did enjoy, like when he's up on that table and everyone's shooting at them. Even though it's crazy, it's unrealistic, it's a really fun scene. There are a couple of scenes throughout it that are dynamic and interesting, and I think weighs heavily on those great moments in the script that you mentioned, that we will talk more about. But some of the interactions, some of those scenes were great. But from a visual effects, if you don't enjoy that gothic feel, you're not going to get anything from the special effects from this movie. You're not going to be wowed by anything.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I did give this movie a 2 as well.
A 2 on the aesthetic, and that's actually where I landed as well. Because again, I think back then I probably would have given this a 4 for the aesthetic, because I wore black clothes and the trench coats and
follow-up questions right now.
All right, I knew this was coming eventually. If I
want
opened
to
the door.
hear more about Gothic Scott.
I feel like that's a conversation for a headspace at some point. I'll give you a little tasty tidbit though, so I did have painted black nails. So there's your tidbit that you can just tease with. I'm not gonna say 24/7. I wasn't a deep goth, but there were at least a number of times where I let the girlfriend paint the nails black.
So you had black nails.
Yep.
You wore a trench coat.
Yep.
Was there any makeup?
No makeup. That was a line I almost never crossed. I think there was probably at one point where she did, maybe mascara the eyes or darken. Is that mascara? Is that what I'm... Oh, man, I'm so bad with makeup. But yeah.
I think what we're looking for is eyeliner.
Eyeliner, that's exactly it.
I'm gonna need pictures.
Most of those don't exist.
Thankfully.
Maybe if we had a Patreon going, that'll be one of the tier levels so they can see the pictures.
I'm prepared to pay. I'm prepared to pay for that. I will bite the bullet for everyone listening and pay this price.
All right, so script. We're going to change this topic as quickly as we can before you find out way too much about Goth Scott. So as I say, the script for me is certainly one of the places where this movie does shine. You have some very iconic scenes. You have some very iconic lines. I mean, I literally can't hear someone say the words "fire up" in any context without immediately want to go "fire it up, fire it up, fire it up," right? Like that super, sticks with you,
but it's forever. It's super uncomfortable every time they do it. You just feel uncomfortable watching it.
I want to explore that. Why? Why do you feel uncomfortable?
I don't know. It's just so cheesy, and they're just such slimy bad guys.
Yeah, that's exactly why I love the line. Is it
Yeah.
it is the epitome of those slimeball things and something that you just picture assholes doing in
Yeah.
the middle of the street. You see looking at each other and firing it up, with their guns in the air.
Yeah, I think that they created something for their bad guys, like a tagline, which was very comic book. Which I like that they were able to create something like that for this movie, but for me, it's just like so sleazy.
Yeah, I can certainly say sleazy, and actually, I think that kind of leads to my biggest problem with this movie, which is, again, never noticed it back in the past, but now looking back with the 2019 lens, it's a complete objectification of women. There is not a single meaningful woman in this movie. Sarah is probably the only female with any agency whatsoever in the film. If you run it down, you've got Shelley herself is just a motivation. We name three things about Shelley.
She got murdered.
Mm-hmm.
She was getting married.
Mm-hmm.
She liked drama, I think.
Deep character, yeah, exactly my point, right? You don't know anything about Shelley through this, and I laugh because, again, when I was a teenager, I'm like, man, I hope one day I have a relationship like Eric and Shelley's. And that's just me not understanding in a way, was there actually a demonstration of a relationship between Eric and Shelley? On top of that, you have Top Dollar's sister, eye candy thing, whatever she's meant to be. I don't know what her purpose in this movie is at any point.
No, I don't know either.
Right.
I think she was just trying to steal eyes. I think that was her
That's
main
it.
focus. She was
Just
trying
they wanted to do a
people's
creepy.
eyes.
I think someone figured out how to do a creepy eye in special effects, and they went, "Okay, let's make a character who can take out eyes." Darla, you have, who's again, don't know much about her. She's maybe a prostitute.
Waitress.
Likes heroin, or she's a bartender.
Was
I
it
can't
heroin
tell.
Or was it morphine? I think it
morphine.
was
It was morphine. Yeah, so I absolutely.
I mean,
morphine.
it might as well have been heroin.
Albright's ex-wife comes up for a brief line, and then you also have the friend female cop, who's there just for a brief bit of exposition. Those are your female characters in this movie. If you take out Sarah,
There was no.
they're sex objects, their motivation, they are nothing but objects throughout this movie, and that is what makes this movie feel so dated, and where I really kind of lost a lot of my nostalgic love for it, was kind of seeing how, ooh, that's so problematic. So that for me was just something I kind of wanted to really bring to the forefront, because again, I think it greatly swayed how I felt about this movie.
Yeah, I can't agree more. There was that. There was a female lead missing, and when we say that, I think that when they tried to recreate this movie for the sequels, and let me just stop right there and say, if you haven't seen the sequels, you don't need to see the sequels. They're really bad. I think that they tried to bring a strong female lead to the next pieces of the story that they tried to tell, and those movies were just so bad that they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to fix that problem. They weren't able to retell this story. It should have been done. They shouldn't have tried to tell this story 3 more times.
I don't even know. At least 2 other movies and a TV show.
Yeah, horrible. I line it right up with everything that came after the first Highlander movie. Everything else about the Highlanders, terrible. Yeah, so don't even waste your time. Just know that they're out there and they're bad and you should avoid them.
Mm-hmm. That said, again, there are so many great lines throughout this movie, whether it's, when he encounters Gideon and kind of misquotes the Edgar Allan Poe, which I actually realize is literally where my love of Edgar Allan Poe comes from, is this movie probably got that ball rolling for me.
Interesting. I immediately kind of caught that and didn't like it because you're quoting the Raven.
Well, they're using ravens for the movie.
Yes,
so
and then that's another thing that we want to bring
appropriate.
up. None of the birds in this movie are crows. They're all ravens because apparently you can't train a crow or something to that effect, or it's easier to train ravens. So I don't know why they decided to use that quote.
Because it's Poe. It was dark. It was 90s. It was edgy. That is literally all that is. And if you try to look too much deeper into that, you see the problems. Mm-hmm. And then again, just leads to one of my also all-time all-time favorite quotes is "shit on me." Because that's just, I'd never heard that expression before in my life. In that regard, and Gideon must say it like I think 8 times. Oh, shit on me, shit on me. And it's one that stuck with me there. As I say, the encounters between Albright and Eric. It can't rain all the time the first time he says that to Sarah and then vanishes. So again, because of these moments, I can't knock it too far down. Back in '98 when I first saw this movie, I would have given this a 5. But again, looking at it now, it's a 3 at best for me. And that's even I feel almost bad going that high.
Yeah, I gave it a 2. Completely opposite. I found the "it can't rain all of the time" scene to be cheesy and not moving at all. It just seemed weird for me. But there were a few scenes, like a few small scenes throughout, a few things that are said. Even the hot dog scene was just a really great piece of banter that seems out of place in this movie. Like, it just was like a filler scene, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, for that reason, I gave this script a 2.
Yeah, you can't put the mustard on first. Absolutely. All right, and that'll bring us to our last category of soundtrack. So, soundtrack. Now, this is certainly one of the things this movie was known for. At some premieres, they actually gave out copies of the soundtrack.
Well, I wasn't aware of that.
And again, it was just so perfectly 90s encapsulating. You had 9 Inch Nails, you had The Cure, you had Stone Temple Pilots,
Rage Against the Machine, Violet Femmes.
Yeah, exactly. And then some other small bands that you probably haven't heard of, but songs that, again, if you know this movie, are ingrained in your head, whether it's Time Baby 2. I literally had to look up that band name for the purposes of this podcast. But they're the band that are playing inside Top Dollar's Club. Like, it's you probably, if you know this movie, you hear that song and go, I know that. But certainly you could never name Time Baby 2 or their song Medicine.
I couldn't do it right now.
But again, it fits so well. It fits the mood. It fits the darkness of it. It's a perfect time capsule for its time in my books.
Yeah, I agree. For a movie that was sort of not mainstream, and I don't know when they got or what deals they made to get these bands on board, but for the time, top notch.
Yeah.
Super popular bands for a relatively low budget movie. So I ended up giving the soundtrack a 4. It's a great soundtrack. You could probably sit and listen to the soundtrack and enjoy it right now. Yep,
absolutely. My favorite fact I learned for this is The Cure. I didn't even know this. This song was written for this movie.
Oh,
like it wasn't, it wasn't like an album song or anything. That was literally written for this movie. The Cure almost never played in concert. They don't really think much of this song, but man, is it such a good one. Like, I'm a fairly big fan of The Cure, and this, to me, it hits a top 5, maybe a top 10 at the very worst kind of spot on their lexicon for me. So, simply fantastic. I give it a 5. It's the 90s grunge kid in me just absolutely ate it up. I was transported back in time listening to it. So, absolute 5 on soundtrack for me.
I can see that. So the next section, like we like to do, is just give this movie an overall score. This score isn't necessarily based on the scores we've given through the movie throughout. This is how we feel about it. So, Scott, your overall score, 1994, The Crow. What do you got?
Again, I wanted to go high with this, but there are just some things that, as I say, I don't feel this movie ages well. And I think so because of that, my enjoyment really did fall off. I didn't get a touch on it much when we were talking about story, but I feel the last 10-15 minutes do kind of drag. It is fantastic when he does have the fight scene on the roof, but to get to that in between the final death of Skag, where his revenge is complete, to get to the rooftop, that part in there really does drag for me. Again, it's really tough because nostalgia fight's really strong, I think, again, for this movie for me. But in the end, I can't go any higher than a 3.
I actually scored it a 3 as well. I enjoyed watching this movie again, and when I score my overall scores, I think, will I watch this movie again in the next decade? And yeah, I probably will.
Absolutely.
So eventually at some point, someone's gonna we'll be at the cottage, and someone's like, "Hey, you want to watch The Crow?" And yeah, I'll want to watch it. Maybe not for the next year or two, but after that, I'll definitely revisit this movie. Definitely interesting for the time. Does it hold up? I don't think it does. I don't think it is creative enough or interesting enough to really hold up to the standards of what you'd want to see today.
Yeah, the action doesn't hold up. Visually, there's a lot of weaknesses to it, so yeah.
Yeah, please don't misinterpret this for me saying I want it to be remade, because I very much don't. But I did give it a 3. If you haven't seen it, worth the watch. If you've seen it recently, don't rush to see it again.
Maybe a loving remaster. If they could touch up the special effects and clean up some of those black edges, the hole in the hand, if they could clean that up, I might get excited behind a remaster, not a remake. Again, I think this was lightning in a bottle for its time. I don't think you could, again, remake this one at this time based on, again, all the attempts that they made with the sequels and the TV shows. That's kind of what we know. So, all right, so that's going to bring us to the end of this episode of Does It Hold Up? Thank you very much for joining us as we talked about The Crow from 1994. Again, we both say, give it a go. So thank you guys for checking out the Mason Guard Show. I am your host, Scott Mason.
And I'm Edward Guard.
And if you would like to see a question or if you have an idea for us, please email us at themasonguardshow@gmail.com. That's MASONGARD show@gmail.com. Again, send us movies that you want to hear us talk about. Let us know your ideas for game shows. We'd love to hear it. Thank you guys very much. We will see you next week.